Before we get started, Governor, if you'd indulge me, you have a lot of fans that have come this morning. I'd like to recognize a few of them. And I'd like to begin with a member of our Board of Trustees, the Honorable Ambassador Robert Tuttle. Bob, thank you for coming. Also from our board, Andrew Littlefair and his son James. Andrew, great to have you. Our former congressman, we miss him so, Elton Gallagher and his wife Janice. Simi Valley Mayor Bob Huber and Westlake Village Mayor Philippa Klessig. Simi Valley Council members Mike Judge and Keith Mashburn. Ventura County Council member James Monahan. Thousand Oaks Council member Al Adam. My good friend, Ventura County District Attorney Greg Totten. Greg. Of course, Ventura County Supervisor Peter Foy. And finally, the director of the Ronald Reagan Library, Duke Blackwood. Duke. Now, our beloved President Ronald Reagan passed away almost 10 years ago. But as many in this audience know, it seems nearly impossible to follow political news without hearing some reference to our 40th president. His memory, his name, and fortunately, his legacy seem to be ubiquitous as our country grapples with the challenges of our time. For many years, probably starting with the day after President Reagan left office in 1989, there's been a famous question often asked when there's a particularly vexing problem facing our country. You've likely heard it before. We, the questioners, often ask, well, what would Reagan do? It's a good question to ask because while times and technology and many faces have changed since President Reagan was in office, some important fundamentals, those that speak to who we are as Americans, have not. I believe that our guest today, Governor Jeb Bush, understands this. And it's one of the reasons that after having left office just about 6 years ago, he remains an extremely important national voice in the Republican Party. As we prepare to welcome the governor to the stage, let's first take stock in a handful of issues that we know were of vital importance to Ronald Reagan and square them up against the words and deeds of Jeb Bush on those same critical topics today. So what are the fundamental issues? Well, let's begin with taxes. We know Ronald Reagan spent much of his life trying to cut them for the average American. He was convinced that it was the man or woman on the street who knew how to spend their dollar more wisely than a distant federal government. And he did all in his power to prove it by cutting taxes. When Governor Jeb Bush was in office, he cut taxes on Floridians by $20 billion. Let's talk about the size of government. When Ronald Reagan was in the White House, he dramatically reduced the rate of growth in federal spending and strove to reduce the size of the federal government. When Governor Bush was in office, he vetoed more than $2.3 billion in earmarks for higher state spending and reduced the size of the state's government payroll by 13,000 people. When Ronald Reagan cut taxes and reduced the size of the government on the national level, he did it with a purpose in mind. It was to spur the free market, create opportunity, and provide incentives for businesses to grow. In his years in office, over 20 million new jobs were created. In Governor Bush's state of Florida, his similar philosophy and economic programs created a thriving state economy where 1.4 million new net jobs were added during his time in office. There are other fundamentally important issues where the two men match. Stemming the rising cost of health care, improving education through accountability and school choice, and as I'm sure we'll hear some more this morning, addressing the vital issues involving immigration that affect all of us. These are all issues addressed by Ronald Reagan years ago that continue to resonate as important topics in our lives, ones in which Governor Bush has demonstrated much needed leadership today. It is for these and many other reasons that Jeb Bush stands as the only Republican governor in the history of the state of Florida to be reelected to office. He hails from a family that has gone out of their way to extend warmth and support to Mrs. Reagan and all of us at the Reagan Library over the years. Let us extend that warmth to him. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Governor Jeb Bush.
Thank you. Very kind.
Thank you.
I'm really honored to be here. Woo. Thank you. Thank you all so much, Ambassador. Great seeing you. Thank you so much. It is an incredible honor to be in this beautiful place. I'm just in awe of what you all have done here, and truly privileged and honored to be here. I thought I would start my remarks by giving you a quick Bush family update. First, I want to thank everybody for their thoughts and prayers for my dad. As he said, put the harps back in the closet. It wasn't time to go. He's always had a pretty good sense of humor, and thank goodness he was right about that. And the harps are back in the closet. That's the good news. He's out of the hospital and regaining his strength little by little. Yesterday, he was at his library, in fact, with Prime Minister Mulroney, and he's been there at Texas A&M now twice in the last 2 weeks, which is a good sign that he is regaining his strength. That's the good news. The bad news, is he's not going to be pampered anymore like he was in the hospital. He has a new caregiver. Her name is Barbara Bush, and she's pretty tough. So I'm always asked about my brother. You haven't seen much about him in the last several months. He's been kind of out of the limelight for a while. So since you asked, Marvin is doing really well. Thanks for asking. Seriously, my brother George and Laura have laid low in the last 4 years. They've maintained, I think, a tradition that is something pretty noble in our country, which is when you leave the stage, you leave the stage. You stop chirping about what's going on, even if the guy that precedes you, now I can say this as a brother, excuse me, even if he uses you as a prop to lower the expectations to make everything look better during your time, my brother, I think, has maintained this tradition that President Reagan did, certainly, and my dad did after him, and that's to leave the stage. They had a chance to serve. It was the greatest joy in my brother's life, and I'm proud of him for showing the self-restraint that I could never have. Two other quick family updates. My son, George P., is proving that it's either genetics or social upbringing, but something compels a Bush to run for office generation after generation. He's running for statewide office in Texas, and I'm really proud of him. Now I know what it's like. Just thinking about it, I get emotional. When my dad was asked about what it was like for his sons to run for office and how he could almost barely complete a sentence. I'm in that same stage now of life, and so he may be crazy for running, but I'm proud of him for doing it, and he's a great guy. And then the last thing I got to tell you about in the Bush family is something that I wasn't a grandfather for way too long, and all the grandfathers and grandmothers of the world would always share their pictures. Have you had that experience? Now I'm the worst culprit. I was thinking about pulling out my phone to show you Georgia Helena Walker Bush. If you think about her name, this could be a place that would get that right away. I speak in some places and I mention her name and her initials. Not everybody gets it, but here, of course, you would. She is the love of our life. And a couple of things about Georgia. If there are any grandparents in the room, I find it amazing that we brought up our children. Whether it was through trial and error, it wasn't always perfect, right? We brought up our children. It's a little bit of a training program to take care of grandchildren, you would think. But once you get grandchildren, your children make you go through another training process to be able to babysit. So we've got to do it twice now. She's 18 months old. My hope is that we can start doing this on a more regular basis. And when I'm alone with her, her nickname is 41. So One final thing about Georgia that I think relates to some of the subject matter I'm going to talk about today. She would be what you would call, I guess, in the politically correct world of American politics, she would be a quadra-hyphenated American. So she is a Iraqi, Canadian, Texan, Mexican, American. So she's got a lot of diversity, which is really kind of the forward-leaning nature of our country in many ways. And 20 years from now, when she pulls out the form that she will have to fill out like all of us, the census form, she'll say not applicable. And that's the way it should be, I think, in our country, where we take away identity politics and focus on the shared values that we have, irrespective of where we come from. My little precious Georgia may be a leading indicator of things to come in our country, and I hope that's right. As I said, it is an incredible honor to be with you all today. My first experience with Ronald Reagan was in Bismarck, North Dakota, believe it or not. And it was at the State Party Convention in 1980. It was in the late spring. Andrew, you may have been there doing advance work. And I was the surrogate for the guy who was kind of in second place in that process. And I walk into this place, there are 4,000 people in Bismarck, North Dakota in 1980. I'm telling you, this was like half the town. Half of North Dakota, I think, at that time was there. And I, for the first time, heard then Governor Reagan speak, and he spoke in such inspirational and aspirational terms that I first was like totally, you know, I'm all in. I mean, this was like exactly the kind of message that what got a 27-year-old guy really excited. And then I realized I'm speaking next. And that was a little nerve-wracking, to tell you the truth, because there was no way that I could compare to the awesome speech that Governor Reagan gave. And so right before I'm getting on the stage, he'd completed his speech, he asked for me. And I went back and said hello, and he said, this is a fairly heated primary, not like we have now where they're, you know, like bloodbaths and babies are dying in the streets and campaigns now. But by its definition, it was a pretty heated primary. And Governor Reagan said, I just wanted to meet you, and if you could I just want to tell you how much I respect your dad. Wow. So I'm hooked for life after that. I am totally on the Reagan team from that moment on. What an incredibly generous man. So then I go out to speak, and the good news is I was still pretty nervous, but he lessened my nervousness quite a bit. The good news was that of the 4,000 people that came to hear the next President of the United States speak, only 400 of them stuck around to hear me speak. And so it got back down to its proper level, and all was well. You know, the election's over, and the president has been reelected, and the new Congress has been sworn in, and we have basically what we had before. Other than the fact we spent $4 billion to have a president be reelected, the Senate remain in one party's hand, and the House remain in the Republicans' hands. We have gridlock. We have variations on these new terms, like sequester, and so last week in Washington they called the snow that never came the snowquester. We have things like the fiscal cliff that we would have thought you'd jump off of and die. Now it's just related to the inability to find common ground on the budget. So we're going from crisis to crisis, and nothing in the election really changed that. Because our beloved nation is divided, the direction we should take is undecided as well. And meanwhile, the power of compounding is not our friend. Our recovery is the weakest it's been in modern times. Our entitlement programs, everybody recognizes, are unsustainable, literally unsustainable, and grow in magnitude without change. Our regulations are outdated, they're complex, they're costly, and they're certainly creating way too much uncertainty. Our education system does not help enough young people gain the power of knowledge to be able to pursue their dreams as they see fit. Our debt levels are way too high, and they're rising rather than declining. Our tax policy is gotten way too complicated, and it punishes savings and success. And our social and economic mobility, something that used to define America, something that we've been proud of for legitimate reasons, that irrespective of where you start, if you work hard and play by the rules, you can achieve great things, that has diminished. We, in fact, amongst the developed country, countries of the world, we're the least economically mobile now. Our country has changed, and our political system, which is so important for us to begin to break through, is not capable right yet, at least, of being able to solve these problems. So what should we do? First, I think we need to create a bipartisan path to high, sustained economic growth. And desperately, as Americans, irrespective of whether we've got an R or a D by our name, we should demand, respectfully and with civility, we should demand leadership. We should demand public leadership. High growth. High economic growth creates more revenue for more people and for government than any creative idea to redistribute wealth or to tax people. High growth exponentially increases revenue. We saw that in the 80s, we saw it in the early 2000s, and it is absolutely true. Low growth or no growth, which is what we've had now for 4 years after the so-called Great Recession, shrinks revenue collection and increases demands on government. Think of the growth of Medicaid or food stamps, which has gone from 32 million to 47 million in 4 years, or unemployment compensation that's gone through the ceiling, and many other elements where the demands on government grow. And so not only are we not getting the kind of revenue we need for government, we're also dramatically expanding the costs of government. The power of compounding can be your friend, or it can be your enemy. Right now, it is our enemy. By inaction, we put ourselves imperiled of really making it harder for the next generation to be successful. The debt loads and our inability to structurally change is now at a point where we have to change it. On the other hand, if we decided as a nation that high economic growth was something that we should aspire to again, just to put it in perspective, a 2% increase in real economic growth compounded over 10 years. Do the math on that. You would think that's not that big of a deal. But in the 10th year, it incrementally creates a Germany. It creates $4 trillion of additional economic activity. It creates millions of jobs. And trust me, it creates enough revenue to be able to fund the things that we need government to do. It would, under the current effective tax rates in our country, it would create $1 trillion of additional recurring revenue for state, local, and federal governments. It seems to me that we could put aside our partisan differences and try to find common ground to be able to go back to the days where 3.5% or 4% growth was what we aspired to and what we tried to create policies to make happen. That's $4 trillion of economic activity that would lift our spirits as well. Our country has always been a positive place, and President Reagan, I think, exemplified this more than any other elected official. He always believed that the next generation would have more opportunities. He always believed in the American spirit, people interacting amongst themselves, that we could create a better day. And by having that kind of growth, my guess is that our spirits as a country collectively would be uplifted again. The best deficit reduction program is a growing economy. And strangely, if you see the debate in Washington today, very little of it is about economic growth, and a lot of it is about what my dad would say, eat your broccoli. You know, it's about the austerity. It's about the tough things that have to get done. Don't get me wrong, but they're much easier to get done in the context of high sustained growth where jobs are being created, where jobs are of purpose and of value for people to be able to pursue their dreams. I have 3 suggestions that I don't think are that partisan. They're not necessarily ideological, that if we just paused and said, we'll have the food fight on all the other stuff, and there's some good things to fight about, trust me, that we could get to the point where we could have higher sustained growth. One would be to create a patriotic energy policy based on American ingenuity and innovation and North American resources. Second, to reform our immigration system and move it towards something that would be part of a high-growth economic strategy, true to our heritage, respecting the rule of law, but moving it to the 21st century where our brand, which is not tarnished around the world, would allow high-achieving people with great aspirations to come and to create opportunities for all of us. And then third, we need stem to stern transformation, not reform anymore, but real transformation of our education system so that more and more children can gain the power of knowledge and be successful in life. We're the most energy abundant country in the world. 10 years ago or 12 years ago, we were about ready to no longer have natural gas. It was an amazing thing. People were building billion-dollar plants to import liquefied natural gas into our country. And today we have so much gas we don't know what to do with it. That's because of American ingenuity and American technology. A Greek immigrant combining two existing technologies, hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling, created the greatest explosion of innovation in the last decade of time, certainly competing with the commercialization of the internet. There should be bands and parades celebrating this incredible thing that we are now on the precipice of being energy secure and all the benefits that have. But unfortunately, I guess, because much of this is taking place in West Texas and North Dakota, it's not cool. The people, I don't know who, there's a little secret committee that decides what's cool and what isn't. This is not cool, and so there isn't the kind of celebrations, but there should be. There should be, because this is something that opens up the door for tremendous benefits for our country. Last year, $300 billion. Last year, $300 billion went out of the coffers of the United States without any economic benefit. Much of this goes to countries that hate us today or are unstable and could quickly learn to hate us immediately after there might be regime change. This is not an effective national security policy where we take the patrimony of our own country to support regimes that don't have the institutions of democratic institutions in place that bring stability for its people. The great news is that we could become the largest producer of oil and gas in the world within a short period of time. And it's something that we should put aside the differences and apply with enthusiasm, create a strategy that would make that happen. And if it did, imagine the benefits. We would have the lowest cost energy source in the world to reindustrialize our country. It would lessen greenhouse gas emissions as more power is generated with natural gas and less from coal. It would save, and it is saving, consumers billions of dollars on their utility bills. It would create hundreds of thousands of high-wage jobs and literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in the infrastructure for our own country rather than just ship a transfer payment out like we did last year of $300 billion. What should we do? Well, first, I would think it's a no-brainer to approve the Keystone Pipeline, for starters. The simple fact is that oil is either heading west to a port to go to Asia, or it's coming south to build the infrastructure that allows us to create jobs and opportunity in our own country and to enhance our own national security. We should have rational regulation for fracking to make sure that it's done responsibly, but it should not be paralyzed. For some odd reason today, we have a hard time applying 21st century rules and regulations on top of economic activity. We apply 1975 rules and make them even more complex and think that that's the best path to do. My guess is to make this industry a permanent part of our high-growth strategy, that we can use 21st century solutions to make this viable and have proper rules around it. We should open up federal lands and waters for drilling, and we should allow the drilling to take place. I don't know if you saw the news today, there's been a pretty serious decline in the last 3 years of oil and gas produced on federal lands. If we want to become energy secure, then we should use those resources for proven reserves that exist. We should create incentives for using natural gas for transportation. It just cries out for, logically, if the price of natural gas per unit of energy is 1/2 or even less than it is for diesel, and the technology exists to be able to expand natural gas, you could save 1.5 million barrels per day of imported oil and expand our own energy to be able to create a more competitive trucking situation. We ought to have incentives for conservation in our homes, in our cars, in our businesses. We should continue, as we have been doing, to consume less. The simple fact is that conservation is the cheapest energy policy that we can get. The energy we don't use is the best is the best means by which we can create a comprehensive strategy. We should let market forces decide where to invest. We should not resort to government venture capital. It's an oxymoron. It doesn't work. The idea... It's been tried. It's failed. Let's move on. And let's trust the interaction of people in their garages, in their labs, in pursuit of their own dreams, creating disruptive technologies that lower the cost of energy for renewables, rather than having people in the bowels of the Department of Energy thinking that they know best. That is the path to a brighter future, and that is the path of getting at least 1% growth per year over the next 10 years. So by the 10th year, we're half of a Germany of incremental economic activity if we embrace this energy policy, which is there for the government to embrace. They don't have to create the policies. It is happening. We just have to eliminate the barriers to accelerate the use of natural gas in our economy. Demography is destiny. I have a question for you all. 10 years from now, you're going to be 10 years older, right? And everybody wants to be here, I hope. The simple fact is that we're all getting older together, and we're not the same. Our fertility rates have dropped dramatically, and we're beginning to have an inverted pyramid that makes our challenges as it relates to entitlements and Social Security even greater. Slow-growing developing countries have had for decades lower fertility rates. Japan and Europe particularly, and Russia. And now China is starting to feel the impact of its one-child policy. We're better off than the rest of the developed world, but our fertility rate has dropped to below break-even, to 1.8, the lowest drop in the last 3 years in recorded history. And unlike most of the world, though, we have a tried and true way to deal with this demographic time bomb. Demography does not have to be destiny if you change course. And the path that we could take is to allow for a strategic reform of our immigration laws so that we can bring young, aspirational people that will rebuild the demographic pyramid to make our entitlement system secure and jumpstart our economy in a way that will create an uplifting of our hopes and dreams, but also immediately impact economic growth. No country can do it like America. Our national identity is based on a set of shared values. And I'm so pleased that the Reagan Library and this effort here is focused on civic education to remind us of what those shared values are. Whether we're native born or not, they are essential for our success as a nation. In America, race is not an identifier of national identity, nor is some exclusionary policy. It is focused on a set of values. It's what sets us apart from the rest of the world. It is our immigrant heritage that has created more dynamism and more innovation than any other country on the face of the earth. And at a time when we desperately need to re-engage and to grow and to be optimistic and prosperous, it seems to me we cannot put aside this huge, powerful catalytic converter for continued progress, as we have done over the last decade of time. I believe that people that want to come to this country, they energize native-born Americans like myself, and if they embrace the values of learning our history, of learning English, they will be a major contributor to our economic vitality. The number of businesses started by native-born Americans has declined from 1996 to 2011, is actually declined. The number of business startups amongst immigrants in that same period has grown by 50%. In 1999, American-born scientists were granted 90,000 patents, compared to 70,000 patents in the United States from scientists that were born in other countries. By 2009, 10 years later, more patents were granted to foreign-born scientists in the United States than native-born scientists. Both parties, I think, are to blame on this. On the one hand, I think the Democrats have seen this as a wedge political issue, hoping it doesn't get solved because they think they win general elections. And on the other hand, sadly, my party and many of you are Republicans view this as a primary election where we have fights about this in the primary to show who's the strongest in terms of border control. And the net effect is politics has been driving the immigration conversation. And I'm so happy today to tell you that that is changing in Washington, D.C., because we desperately need reform. We need to continue to improve border security and tracking down 40% of the people that come illegally come with a legal visa and they just overstay their time. We need to be able to use technology to be able to track those folks and politely ask them to leave when their legal visa expires. We should do what we can to make it easier for people to come legally than to come illegally. The great majority of people that come here come for good reasons. They come to provide for their families. They come because their children are hungry. They come because they want a better life for their families, but they can't come legally because our system has been overwhelmed and it is not working. So a system going forward must say that it is harder to come illegally and that there's a price higher to come illegally than actually having a chance to come legally. If we had it... We need to move to an economic growth-driven system. That means family-based immigration should be narrowed back to where it was 40 years or 50 years ago, to reuniting spouses and their minor children. The change has allowed for adults to claim their brothers and sisters and their elder parents, and then they get to make the same claims once they get a green card. And we've created what is called chain migration that has clogged our immigration system and made it harder for economic immigrants to come to our country. Work-based visas should be increased based on need. Graduates of STEM fields should stay if they have a job or start a business. We only need to look north, I think, to find a better way. At the same time, the United States' share of economic immigrants has dropped from 18% to 13% between 1991 and 2011. It soared in Canada from 18% to 67%. Indeed, even though Canada has 1/10 of our population, they have more economic immigrants because they've developed a strategy to make this part of their economic growth. And the United States could do the exact same thing. H-1B visas should be expanded and a path of residency should be made for them easier. In 2007, there was 1 million H-1B visa holders that were trying to get 144,000, I believe, green cards that are given annually. There's a term to this. So what we're doing is training people with high skills that could be the next generation of innovators that allow us to be competitive and successful. We're training them, we're giving them hope that they can stay, and then they leave. And where do they go? They go to the countries that are competing us for the creation of high-wage jobs. This is madness. We need to change the system so it's part of our economic interest to allow these dreamers and people of great talent to stay in our country and make a difference here. We need a guest worker program based on economic need again to help sustain industries like tourism and agriculture. With better technology and more sophisticated enforcement, I think we need to expand dramatically tourist visas because of its huge impact. Now that may be because I'm from Florida. I guess I'm biased in that regard. But why wouldn't you want to have visitors come and spend all the money they want to in Disneyland or Disney World or some other places to be able to create immediate economic activity for our country? And for the millions who are here illegally, there needs to be a path to legal status achieved by paying a fine, learning English, not violating the laws over an extended period of time. It is not the American way to keep people languishing in the shadows. Ronald Reagan would not approve of this. What would Reagan do? He would work for comprehensive immigration reform to give people a chance of living a life of dignity outside the shadows where they can make a full contribution to the success of our nation. And then finally, if we're to get this right, we need to have civics education elevated, not just for immigrants, although certainly that is important, but for all of us. All of us. We cannot have an immigration policy where multiculturalism is the core kind of foundation of our nation. We have to have shared values, and the only way to have shared values is for people to embrace them, to understand them, to appreciate them, and that should not just be for immigrants, it should be for all of us. It is maddening to see these polls that show that people don't know their 3 branches of government, or that the Constitution, they confuse the Constitution with the Declaration of Independence, or all the things that we see. It's because our schools have not had the incisive focus on restoring civic education to education, and that should be part of any immigration strategy. So if we do these 2 things, an economically driven immigration strategy, a patriotic energy strategy, my guess is we're getting pretty close to that 2% incremental growth that creates a rebirth of our country. But the way to sustain it is to assure that every child gets the kind of education that allows them to be successful in the pursuit of their own dreams. And sadly today, the greatest country on the face of this earth has more or less the following results. After spending more per student than any country in the world, A third of our kids are college and or career ready by the time they complete their journey through 12th grade. A third get a piece of paper that says you're a high school graduate, but if they go to a community college or a four-year university, they're going to have to take remedial courses. They're going to have to redo English and math. So they've got something that says they have something of value, but in effect, they have to redo what they didn't quite learn the first time. And then a third, more or less, depending on the state, drop out. That is not acceptable for a country that wants to aspire to economic opportunity for everybody. It is why we have less social mobility and economic mobility today. It is why we're creating a permanent group of people who are stuck in poverty. They don't want to be there. They don't want their children to be there. We have to figure out a way to transform our education system so it, irrespective if you're from a barrio or from urban core Los Angeles, or if you're living wherever you live, and your children and your family comes from low income, it doesn't matter. Because you're going to get the same quality expectation. We're going to have the same expectations for every person in the system and every child to assure that we get the kind of learning gains that breaks this cycle of despair and poverty that exists today. This perhaps is the highest national priority for our country. I am tired. I fought this fight as governor for 8 years, and I continue to fight it within the realm, the game you're supposed to play. But I am tired of hearing people say it's not fair to have high expectations and robust accountability because it's not fair because of broken homes, or it's not fair because children come from poverty. It's not fair to teachers. It's not fair, when in fact, what's not fair is to have 2/3 of those children, after spending more per student than any country in the world, not be able to be college or career ready when they get through to 12th grade, if they make it at all. That's what's not fair. So, in Florida, we graded schools A, B, C, D, and F, 100% based on student learning. The transparency was incredible. People knew what an F was and knew what an A was. They didn't like Fs, they wanted As. And the system began to move. We ended social promotion in 3rd grade for functionally illiterate readers, which California ought to consider doing, to deal with this achievement gaps that exist. So you intervene early to make sure that the gaps don't grow so big that the kids lose hope. We focused on early childhood literacy, and we put reading coaches in every school to teach teachers how to teach reading, because our schools of education don't do a great job on that. We embarked on the biggest set of school choice programs, both public and private, in the country, now being emulated by other states, to put pressure on the system and empower parents, particularly low-income parents, to have the choices that people that live in affluence have. And the results were that Florida, which was at the bottom of the pack in 1997, based on the nation's report card, has moved up dramatically, above the national average, to the extent, by the way, that low-income Hispanic kids in Florida on the 4th grade reading test do better than the California average. I am proud of the gains that Florida's made, but there's a lot of work that needs to get done. And it is shameful that we allow a system that casts away an entire generation. It can change, and in Florida's case, we moved the needle to put us in a place for continued improvement. My hope is that people realize, while this is not necessarily a federal issue, this is something that should be of national purpose. That a little bit of our time and energy ought to be to challenge the system that has created these kinds of abysmal results before it's too late. And if we do those 3 things, we'll still have the fights on the size and scope of government, the level of taxation, whether there's equity in the tax policy and all that. That's fair game. But those 3 things would create a greater chance of sustained economic growth. And my guess is that the great divide that appears to exist right now might begin to narrow. That our issues, the differences might not look as deep as they are today. But all of this is going to require leadership. This does not happen by osmosis. You don't change the path you're on without public leadership changing directions. Too many people in public life, I think, try to follow what the polls say and then kind of mirror back what people are thinking at any given time. That is not leadership, and that certainly won't change the direction that the country is taking, is on. Leadership is hard to define, but Americans pretty much get it when they see it. We see it when someone thinks first of the greater good. What does a nation need to do and where does it need to go? To a great leader, everything else comes second. Like I said, politics, the polls, personal pride, financial success, and even friends sometimes. Leaders are sometimes forged in crisis. Sometimes they do their best work when nobody's noticing. But we always see the results. It takes strong leadership to produce bold results. We've seen that time and time again in recent history. And it is certainly a lesson to remember as we look to the dawning challenges we face in the near future for our country. Effective leadership comes in many forms and from both political parties. President Kennedy led us through vision and inspiration when he challenged America to land a man on the moon. He led. Lyndon Johnson used forceful hands-on leadership that produced historic civil rights legislation and a 25% across-the-board income tax cut in just 6 weeks after the assassination of President Kennedy. He cajoled, he hugged, he begged, he threatened, he praised, he did what a hands-on leader does, and his hands were huge. And the stories about Johnson grabbing people by the shoulder and just getting right in their grill to make them realize how important it was to get things done was a sign of leadership that we need today. He led. Or how about my dad in managing of the fall of the Iron Curtain? As the Soviet Empire was collapsing, there were significant dangers that there would be violence of epic proportions. The United States could have justifiably done a victory dance over the Soviets, particularly, for example, when the Berlin Wall fell. I'll never forget watching my dad on TV, and critics, the pundits, were all saying, well, he should go over there and celebrate with the German people. Had my dad done what the people of the here and now wanted to do, rather than be a leader, it could have created greater vulnerabilities for Gorbachev to be able to create an orderly transfer without bloodshed. Amazingly so. A dictatorship of epic proportions in the 20th century fell without a drop of blood. It was an amazing feat thanks to the fantastic leadership of Ronald Reagan and then the humility of George H.W. Bush to do the right thing rather than do the thing that might make him look popular. These are the kind of leadership skills that are necessary today for our country. To be effective, a strong leader must adhere to basic principles and be humble and accommodating in pursuit of them. There is no greater example of that than the man for whom this library is named. Almost 6 years ago, Senator Ted Kennedy stood here and praised the former president with whom he had engaged in so many political battles. He called Ronald Reagan a good friend and a gracious foe. He wanted to defeat his opponents, but he didn't want to destroy them. President Reagan took office with two evil empires in his sights. One was the Soviet Union, and the other was a federal government intruding ever more into the lives of its citizens. He brought down the former and helped rein in the latter by doing what might be considered unthinkable today. He embraced his adversaries. Two people can disagree. In fact, they can disagree vehemently. But if they see in each other an honest broker motivated by good intentions and sincere beliefs, they can find accommodation. That was the secret to President Reagan's success. He was considered the most bellicose of cold warriors, but forged the most productive working relationship ever between an American president and a Soviet premier. Together, he and Gorbachev signed the first treaty eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. President Reagan envisioned the day that all nuclear weapons would be eliminated. He was portrayed by the press and by adversaries as a reckless hawk, but at his core, he was the most optimistic dove during his time. For him, the American dream was not just rhetoric, said Gorbachev. It was something he felt in his heart. President Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill were polar opposites in how they viewed the role of the federal government. They clashed often, and yes, even sniped at each other from time to time in the press. But to quote Tip's son, Thomas O'Neill, what both men deplored more than the other's political philosophy was stalemate, and a country that was so polarized by ideology and party politics that it could not move forward. That's pretty refreshing if you think about it in the context of today. So they talked often. They had lunch. They shared Irish stories. They might have had a pop or two in the evening, not during the day for sure. And together, through this bond of personal relationship, even though they had disparate views about the size and scope of government, they saved Social Security for a generation and passed the greatest overhaul of our tax code in a generation of time. President Reagan had countless sessions with both Democrats and Republicans. And it seems that today, whenever such a meeting occurs, the precursor to it is the press conference where, someone is like beating up the poor person who's going to show up to meet privately before the meeting even begins. Which is why I'm excited that President Obama seems to have changed course in the last 3 days. Let's see. I'm sincere about this. It seems now he's invited Republicans for the first time to dinner. 12 senators and the president discussing without press conferences before, without much comment afterwards, to see what each side has in terms of what their aspirations are. He had lunch with Paul Ryan yesterday. This is a change that I think we should encourage, whether it's motivated for all sorts of reasons that we don't understand or not. Ronald Reagan would have done that. George Bush would have done that. And for our country to be successful, we have to put aside some of this vitriol that exists and begin to recognize that just because the other side doesn't have our views, it does not mean that they're not motivated for love of country. We have to get to a different place where we can find broader consensus based on principles. That's how we will win. So Ronald Reagan, for me, is someone who is a role model, not because of his great success, he's certainly that, but he's also a role model for the political system that we have today. Imagine a country with the energy resources that we have, with the immigrant heritage that we have that has been our blessing, with the ability to solve the problems that seem intractable today. This country will take off. This country will be the inspiration for the rest of the world. We will regain our footing and we will rebuild the greatest country on the face of this earth. And it requires the kind of leadership that Ronald Reagan showed each and every day, and that is why I'm honored to be here. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Too much.
Thanks.
5 minutes. You want to take a couple questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Governor. We've got 6 minutes of time to take just a couple of questions. If you have a question, you could raise your hand, and 2 things. Just wait till we put a microphone in it. And second, if you could tell us who you are. So we'll start right over here.
Peggy Sadler. Governor Bush, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I was curious, with your great results in education in Florida, did you have to deal with a difficult teachers union?
It's not the CTA, Congressman, but it's the FEA. I'd say the teachers union is one of the more powerful political forces in Florida. I hope it's not as powerful as your teachers union here. But I wish I could tell you that we found accommodation. But the reality is, if you're advocating reforms that change the system, people that are organized around the economic interests of the adults, that's their job. Their job is to collectively bargain for the adults. In the case of Florida, the teachers union represents teachers, of course, and they also represent other public school employees. They do it well. But to expect them to embrace school choice or higher accountability or the kinds of things that we did, I didn't expect it and I didn't get it. And so it was a political fight. It required staying the course. It required faithful execution on the laws that the legislature passed. We were all in for 8 long years to kind of get the results that we had. Teachers generally, I think, moved towards seeing the benefits of this new system. The union itself didn't, and they still to this day are opposed to most substantive reforms, not just in Florida, but around the country. I wish it was different, but it's part of the process of the fight. And sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you find a way to find common ground, but when you don't, you got to sort it out politically, And in my case, that's what we did. I ran for re-election on these reforms. I got elected, which gave me a pass to continue to do what I was doing. And apart from being a joy to serve, it also allowed us to have enough time to show the kind of gains that we got. And now other states are emulating that around the country.
We're here.
My name is Ellen Parker.
Hello.
Hi. I asked you when you were signing if you were going to save us.
Uh-huh. That's a question. I guess. I am optimistic that there is a growing consensus. People's views of the political system are so, people are angry and frustrated that I think it's beginning to change the system. And I think the Republican Party has seen the need for a more positive, proactive message, not just to be against things, but to go back to the days of being the place where the interesting ideas were developed and advocated, where reform was at the heart of what we believed. And if we do that part, then the country's going to be saved by the American people, not by, you know, an aspiring elected official or one that might ponder it later on. We can't wait. We can't wait till 2016 to begin to change the direction of the country. It has to start now, and that's the message.
We've got time for just one more question. We'll go right up here on the balcony, Governor.
Oh.
Hi, Fred Ganados from Royal High.
Hey,
and,
how you doing?
Good. I'm a recent immigrant here.
Where are you from?
Philippines.
Excellent. Round of applause for the Philippines.
I was wondering what if the children was like the illegal parents came here with their child?
Yep.
And what if they grow up and stayed? Would they be, and then learned their full education throughout high school? They finish their education and then do they stay here or do they leave?
So the law right now is in limbo. The president has, I'm not sure he has this executive power, but it's in the process of being challenged, and you know, this is the problem, our courts take so long, but he either unilaterally or by delegated authority extended the period of time for the so-called DREAM Act students who you're describing to stay in the country for 2 years, but it doesn't offer a permanent solution to this. In the book that I've written called Immigration Wars, we propose a path to legalization for adults, a path to citizenship for their children under the theory that the sins, if this is a sin, that's not the right term, but the illegal immigrants break the law, that their children should not be penalized for that. And so in your scenario, I'm not sure you're talking about anybody you know, we'll just leave it at that. You would be under the suggestions that are being discussed right now in Washington to reform immigration, and what Clint Bolick and I, who wrote this book, believe, that you would be given a path, or not you, excuse me, the person that you described would be given a path to citizenship over time. And you would have to, one would have to get a GED or graduate from high school or enlist in the military. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Okay, good luck.
Governor, on behalf of everyone here, we just want to thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you all.